So, I'm going to hand over to my Commission colleague, Enrique Garcia-John, who's going to talk on conclusions from the Commission's report on the granting of authorizations for substances with ED properties. And this is the third of those document clusters I showed to you some slides back. So, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Hang on. Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. I will try to be very brief, considering I'll be presenting a document which was already published in December 2016, and that probably most of you already know it. So indeed, the REACH ED review by the Commission. As you know, Article 38(7) of REACH asked the Commission to assess whether or not, taking into account the latest developments in scientific knowledge, to extend the scope of Article 63 to substances identified under Article 57F as having endocrine disrupting properties. This is legal and Commission language for saying basically whether all endocrine disruptors should only be authorized following the socioeconomic route. So it basically has to do with how are we going to deal with EDs in authorization. At the time when REACH was closed, we didn't have sufficient information and agreement to make a decision whether they should always go via the socioeconomic route or not, as it was, for example, for the non-threshold carcinogens. And the decision was left for later. And this commitment for review was undertaken by the Commission, and after consultation, long consultation with many, many people, including EU agencies, member states, the Commission's Science Service, JRC, and stakeholders of multiple natures, we came up with the report to Council and Parliament, which is the purpose of my discussion today, my presentation today. The document and the background can be obtained from the following link. And this report covers a number of elements. It gives some context on the basic questions whether what is an ED in the context of the review, and there we link with the WHO IPCS definition of an endocrine disruptor, what is understood to be a threshold in the context of applications for authorization. There are also some considerations about what science tells us about how thresholds are determined and how this might be somewhat more difficult for endocrine disrupting properties. At the end of the document, there are some discussions or some elements relating to the policy aspects regarding what route of authorization to choose for EDs under REACH, and some conclusions. When we're talking about thresholds in the context of applications for authorization, we have some places to hold on for this. On one hand, the ECHA guidance documents on delivering or developing dose response relationships discuss relevant thresholds, and there we talk about guidance R8 and R10 on how to do a CSR. Basically, for human health effects, when we are talking about thresholds, we will be talking about DNLs, the derived no effect levels, which can be considered as thresholds for the purposes of an authorization, or when doing a risk assessment supporting an authorization. When we are talking about effects on the environment, we have equivalent type of values, the so-called predicted no effect concentrations, or PNECs, that can be considered as thresholds as well, and guidance describes how to go about deriving these values. For non-threshold substances, that is, for those for which it is not possible to determine a DNL or a PNEC, an authorization can only be granted if the socioeconomic benefits outweigh the risks to human health or the environment, and no suitable alternative substances or technologies are available. This is in the text of REACH, and it is what we normally call the socioeconomic route for granting an authorization. So if no threshold, if the determination of a threshold is not possible, then the socioeconomic route applies. This is also the case, by the way, not only if there is not a threshold, but also if it is not possible to determine it because there is no sufficient data to determine that there is a threshold. So whether it is theoretically not possible or whether it is not possible to demonstrate it, in both cases we are left at the same place. We have to go down the socioeconomic route. In order to facilitate the evaluation by ECHA's committees of applications for authorization, RAC has already in the past derived reference DNLs, that is for effects which have a threshold, and those response functions, or those response curves, for those effects which do not have a threshold, or for which one could not be determined for most CMR substances already in Annex 14. This has been a work that RAC has been consistently and effectively doing, also to support applicants in the last couple of years. It's to be remembered that these reference values are not legally binding, but they have been developed by RAC mainly to provide this predictability on how they would like the applicants to do and document the risk assessment that they include in their application for authorization. So I think this has proven to be a good experience, useful for RAC, useful for the applicants, and we believe overall useful for all. More science considerations on threshold or of ED-related effects, which are also discussed in the report. It is said that the issue of whether there is a threshold or not for a substance with ED effects is a case-by-case assessment. The report briefly discusses, and I will not go into the details, the uncertainties surrounding the determination of thresholds for these kinds of substances. For example, due to the limitations in the current testing methods, which might not cover, for example, the whole life cycle or all the relevant parts of the life cycle which are important for the assessment, issues around the potential existence, and it's more and more reported, of the possibility of non-monotonic dose-response curves, and issues around dealing with the critical windows of exposure in which the effects happen. So all of these are difficulties which have often been discussed for endocrine disrupting substances, although it is recognized that they also play a role for other non-ED effects. More details, of course, can be found in the report and in the references which appear in the footnotes of that report. So there are some conclusions provided in this report, which I think were awaited. First of all, we believe that there is no need to amend REACH. It already has the necessary tools to deal with granting authorizations, also for EDs and for doing the risk assessments. As it is the case for all substances subject to the authorization requirement under REACH, it is a responsibility of the applicant to demonstrate that a threshold exists and to determine that threshold in accordance with Annex 1 to REACH. So this is, I think, a very clear message. And like for most of the other obligations in REACH, it is the duty to prove his case is on the applicant. Then it is, of course, up to the Risk Assessment Committee of ECHA to scrutinize this assessment and decide whether they agree or not with what is being put forward. Furthermore, as for other substances, and in order to increase predictability and legal certainty to applicant, the RAC may on a case-by-case basis set reference DNLs or reference dose response curves. So basically the practice which has already been undertaken for other substances such as CMRs is certainly something that the report considers should, of course, this is at the decision of RAC, be followed also for EDs. The adequate control route applies for those substances, as already has been said, for which a threshold exists and can be determined. Although it seems quite obvious, when this is not possible, the only other possibility is to go down the socioeconomic route. And finally, even though when determining, and this is acknowledged and has to do with the difficulties which are, I think we all understand, that exist when dealing with determining thresholds for endocrine disrupting substances, it is acknowledged that although determining a threshold might be particularly difficult for EDs, it cannot be excluded that this will be possible. And I think this ties in well with the scenario in which the rest of the discussions today come in relation to the two substances which are the subject of today, the non-alphenyl and octalphenyl ethoxylates and their degradation products. Whether a threshold is possible or not, we have already seen, and I think we will discuss more in detail the state of play today, and there I think both the MSc and the RAC documents are very relevant, and where we can go on from here in this discussion about threshold, non-threshold, and if it is non-threshold, how to deal with it under the socioeconomic route. So I think that is all from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Enrique.